Hey, welcome back to the Bullpen Sessions podcast. I am stoked today because I am sending out a warning shot. If you are listening in and you don't like energy, turn this episode off.
Bye.
Because the gentleman I have joining me today is not only a good friend, an industry colleague, the man might have the most energy you will ever hear out of individuals. So with that being said, Kareem Cade, welcome to Bullpen Sessions.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon to my brother, man, my friend. It's exciting to be here, man.
Well, we're gonna get into some topics here about building solid teams within the insurance industry. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about Kareem Cade. Tell me about your childhood growing up in the Detroit metro area.
Specifically, we're talking teamwork here, Andy.
Well, here's where I want to go with this to set the stage. So for the folks that listened to my episode a couple weeks ago where I announced kind of how the podcast is making a transition.
Yes.
I'm still interviewing folks that have an athletic background, but come from the industry or have some tie to the industry. And then we're going to go into some tactical things like today about building a solid team with good leaders. But what I love about your story growing up from an athletic standpoint, Kareem, is here you are, a kid growing up in the Motor City, Motown, right?
Yep.
Kids probably say, oh, so Kareem, what were you? Good basketball player, good football player? No. Tell your story. It's not the case.
No, not at all. Andy, contrary to popular belief, I'm a swimmer, man. Not only was I a swimmer, my daughter lettered in swimming. So we kind of got this black swimming family going on here. That's a little bit different than the norm. So I played basketball recreationally, of course. Played a little baseball recreationally. So, I mean, you hang out, but I was never good enough to make teams. I went out for teams in 6th grade, 7th grade, never. But I was always swimming. So I swam at the time for the YMCA. So I started with the YMCA, but my mother put me in the water. I think I was 6 months old when my mother put me in the water. And from there on, I always loved being in the water. But I started going to the YMCA. And I swam for the Fisher YMCA here in Detroit, which is no longer around. But I swam there and I started competing. And I was being swim meets on the weekend. And man, we would swim. And if you can imagine, especially back then, you're talking about I'm 51 now. We would show up to these YMCAs and we'd be probably the only black team in the building. And we had some great swimmers. Now, I was a good swimmer. I was not one of the great swimmers, but I swam. That took me to my freshman year of high school where I swam. And then I had this little thing called practice, something that a lot of us don't like to do. And that kind of kicked me out the game because I'm like, I don't want to go to swim practice at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning. That doesn't make sense to me. I can't make that make sense. But I was a swimmer, man. I am a swimmer. And I've got to throw this shout out because I got my daughter involved with swimming. She actually swam 4 years of high school and lettered and was team captain in her final year of swimming, man. So it's a strong story for swimmers because they usually don't see folks that look like me talking about swimming, brother. So that's my sport.
I hear you. Hey, I too grew up swimming.
Okay.
We had a good local YMCA program. I swam for a team called Lake Country Phoenix, which actually became a very well-known program around here. And I can remember, it's funny, I stopped swimming once I got into high school, middle school, high school. And then I started doing triathlons as an adult. And I'll tell you what, man, swimming does not come back easily.
Oh, no. But it's tough. I mean, just to get the breathing down, to get everything that goes along with it. It's a tough deal, but I still love being in the water today. I mean, I'll go get in the pool in a minute. No problem.
Well, the next time we're together, we're going to go swim some laps.
Oh, man, I'm with it.
What was your event? What was your event?
So I was breaststroke and freestyle. Those were my two events.
Okay, I got to share this because I need tips, and I think anybody here who has a kid swimming at a young age will love this. So I swam on a very competitive team, as I just mentioned.
Yes.
My weakness was the breaststroke.
No.
Because I would get to the end of the pool.
Yeah.
And they'd say, son, you've been disqualified because whatever I was doing was cheating.
Yeah. And even tapping out. You got everything is correct, but it's back to the breathing like we were talking about before. Just the breathing. I loved it because I had to glide in between and I got a little rest. I mean, it was there, but I could get a little rest in there between. Freestyle, it's just nonstop, right?
It's chaos, yeah.
It's chaos, brother. And so at least with breaststroke, I get a little bit. You're going, but you got a little action. And so, maybe I was a baby frog and just didn't know it, man. I got my kicks down and everything in the place. So it was a great time. So I still love it. I still do breaststroke.
Well, I'll tell you what, man. I am a lover of certain moments in sports history where, I can go back to YouTube and watch them over and over again. One of them is like Mariano Rivera's last outing on the mound in Yankee Stadium. But the one I'll always go back to if I want to get jacked up is the 2008 Olympics when the U.S. beat France.
Yes.
That leg, forgetting the guy's name, that swam the last leg, the freestyle to beat the French, was still one of the greatest moment in history.
Yeah, because I'm thinking who was on. Lochte was on. Who was all on that team?
No, Lochte was not. It was one of the guys from Wisconsin, and I'm forgetting his name. He had a hyphenated last name, but then you had Michael Phelps.
Phelps, yeah.
I'm forgetting the other gentleman, who African American.
Yes.
And then the last guy, dang it, I'm forgetting his name. But the time at which the speed at which he swam that last 100.
Yes.
I still remember. You still watch it, and the announcers are like, "It's over. The French are going to win." And then all of a sudden, like, "Wait a second, wait!" And then that comeback was unbelievable.
And just think about the team in that piece. I mean, you know where everybody's strengths are, and everybody's got to do their part. I just need you to hold your end, because I'm gonna come back on the back end and grab this thing. Don't worry about it. That's something strong, man. We talking about it from a team perspective. That's awesome.
You want to know how to be part of a team? So when I was a kid swimming, I was on the best relay team we had, but we had two of the best studs. We had a kid probably at age 10 that was breaking times of 14-year-olds. That's how good he was. He was on the back end of our relay. Yep. I kicked it off, put the weak link out there first, but man, I won a lot of gold medals that way.
Hey, I was the kickoff guy. I'm like, I'm gonna get us in the game a little bit. I'm gonna keep us close, but now the rest of y'all come on in and do what you do. Yeah. And my daughter was the same. My daughter was, awesome. And I said, well, she'll go to school and the college and have a swimming scholarship. She's like, yeah, no, Dad, I'm not doing that anymore. I don't want to do any more wetlands, dry lands, none of that. I'm done.
Well, and you talk about sports that are time consuming, swimming, the exhaustion. You talked about getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning to go to practice. Sometimes you have 2 a days. 2 a day. And then the length you're swimming at each practice is just insane.
Non-stop, man. It's so good to see you, brother. I'm excited about this today.
Well, let's dive into another. You're a sports fan like myself. And if you're listening to the audio, you can't see the video. This man is decked out in red. All things Kansas City Chiefs. So before we get into that, how does a man born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, become a Kansas City Chiefs fan?
Man.
Understandable, because the Lions have been bad for a long time.
The Lions have been bad.
But how do you become a Chiefs fan?
So here's what's crazy. I got a crazy story. And so I'm growing up, my inside the household, my parents were not big Lions fans. Now, of course, Lions would be on, but my dad was a huge, and still is today, a huge then Oakland Raiders fan. And he loved the black and silver. That was his deal. And unfortunately, during that time, I didn't have the greatest relationship with my dad. I mean, it's much better today, but didn't have the greatest relationship with my dad. And so as a kid, what did I do? I rooted for the team that was against my dad. And who had the most rivalry? Well, it was Kansas City. I mean, you could do anybody in the AFC West, but Kansas City and the Raiders just went at it all the time, from changing coaches to changing team members. I mean, you name it. I mean, we go through all the list of players that came from those two teams between each other, and it was always beef. And so at 13, here it is. I pick up the Chiefs and I start following the Chiefs. Then it's this little game that's probably, I'm dating myself here, Andy, called Tecmo Bowl. And Tecmo Nintendo, right? And so I would play with the Chiefs on Tecmo Bowl. I mean, that was my deal. I could get a little Christian Okoye in there. I could, you know what I mean? I can mix it up a little bit. And that was it. So from there on out, I roll with the Chiefs. So the beautiful thing about us having these wins now, man, is that all of my friends, my childhood friends, they're like, we can't say anything. This guy is not a bandwagoner. He's been riding with these guys since 13 years old. He's never went back on it. He's never doubled back, never been a fair weather friend, took him all the way through. So right now he's got all bragging rights, you know. So now they don't like me anymore. They're like, man, we're tired of seeing you win. Oh, that's okay. I waited a long time for that, Andy. I waited a long time for it.
Well, you brought back some memories with Tecmo Super Bowl.
Yes, sir.
I too liked to play with Christian Okoye, but you know what my beef was?
What's that?
He would get hurt by week 3 because of, and then he would go down with an injury.
He's taking the bruising. That was what he's there for.
We only had 2 rules, though. There were only 2 teams or people you could not beat whenever we played. You could not beat the Falcons because they had Deion Sanders, and it was impossible to throw with Deion Sanders. And then you couldn't be, actually 2 teams. You couldn't be the Bills or the Oilers.
Really?
Because they were so good offensively, it was like impossable to stop them. If you were the Oilers with Warren Moon and all those receivers, you can't stop them.
You can't stop them. And Buffalo at that time, they were on the run. What was Buffalo? 4 Super Bowls in a row or something like that?
Yeah, 0 for 4.
0 for 4. And they still say that. I was just with some Buffalo fans the other day, and they're like, "Oh, here's the Chief guy." I'm like, "Well, one day you'll beat us. You keep loading up. One day you'll beat us."
Well, let's talk about this. So it's a good segue because Kareem, you got your Kareem Chiefs jersey on, number 50, because you just celebrated a 50th birthday. So
yes,
happy
sir.
belated birthday.
Yes, well, no, actually, this is a jersey from 11 months ago because I turned. So I'll be 51 this Saturday. So now I'm gonna have to get an updated jersey, right? I'll be 51 this Saturday. But for the big 5-0, I celebrate, and I had a custom jersey made.
So for those who want to get Kareem a birthday gift, we are recording this on this July 17th. So your birthday would be July 22nd.
Saturday, baby.
You want to give
and I think I shared this with you too, Andy, that I'm born on my mother's birthday. So me and mom celebrate the same birthday. So, mom and I are looking to hang out.
That is awesome. Well, happy early birthday.
Well,
I'm going to make sure Amy Essig gets a nice gift in the mail for you. You had mentioned offline, we were talking about the Chiefs Super Bowl win this year. This sets up today's top conversation.
Yeah.
One thing you said that was really good about this team, because I think a couple of years ago, man, they were stacked.
Yes.
But what you talked about this year was how this team wasn't full of all-stars. Yeah, you got Mahomes and you got Kelsey and all those guys, but this team was a little different. They weren't filled with first-round draft picks.
Yeah, what I think about it is that when the original trade came with Tyreek Hill, I had my buddies calling me. They're like, "Oh, that's the end of your dynasty. It's over." And for one moment, you could begin to think along those lines because there was so much connection between Mahomes and Hill. And of course, always at the end of those games, it was always about how do we move fast? And that was the fastest way to get it done, right? You could change the course of the game in 13 seconds. You think you're winning, and hey, Mahomes to Hill, game over, done deal. And so it was interesting to see, and I think as we're talking about leadership and looking at teamwork, to see how Pat would evolve, how the team would evolve, because everybody counted him out from the beginning of the season. It was still like, okay, well, it's decent. And then if you recall too, Andy, the whole AFC West built their teams to beat Kansas City. So you started looking at what happened in the West, and I'm like, I got concerned. As a fan, I am a fan, but as a fan, you're kind of like, wow, they're stacking to beat us. They weren't even stacking to go to the Super Bowl. They were stacking to beat us such that we didn't get another AFC title overall. But to look at what he was able to do, and I say as a team, because we know that comes from coaching. Even now we're looking at people saying that Eric Bieniemy is gone now. What does that look like for us from offensive coaching standpoint? We don't know. I still know that we've got Big Red there and we've got Pat. And Pat, to me, evolved as a leader. And I think that is what, as we begin to have this conversation today, looking at how do you bring out the best in other folks that are on your team, because everybody doesn't show up as a superstar. But here it is. You had Pacheco, 7th round running back. You had Sky Moore, who was brand new to the team. You had Kadarius Toney that hadn't been. And so these guys were all guys that had not been proven in the league, but yet they came out and supported that. And so you look at, I think he was at some point at 10, 11 different receivers in the game. Think about that from when you've been used to 1 or 2 targets, that now you've got to see everybody. And so what I looked at, what was the evolution for me from a leadership standpoint, is that how many people am I not seeing in my organization because I've just never paid attention to it because they weren't the Tyreek Hills. Who did I let fall? You and I talk about this all the time. Who did I let leave the organization because I couldn't see the potential in what they had? And as a leader, I didn't develop it. But I love what this team did this year. Pat developed everybody on that team, bro. It was amazing.
Well, and there's so much to unpack there. Number one, I got to share this. I am one of the worst fantasy football players in the history of that sport.
Okay.
I've played for more than 10 years, never made the playoffs until this year, and I made the Super Bowl.
Now,
wow. Check this out. I lost the Super Bowl because the game that decided the Super Bowl came down to the Monday Night Football game between the Bengals and the Bills when Damar Hamlin went down.
Yes.
And when that game got postponed, we made the decision that wherever the score's at is the final score. Okay. And I was losing in the Super Bowl, the fantasy Super Bowl, and we stopped the game, obviously for justified reasons.
Right.
But I was going to share with you, my secret weapon at the end of the year was Pacheco.
Oh, no question. But and you think about 7th round, coming out of Rutgers, but just ran with a purpose, man. Just an underdog. It's something about an underdog, Andy, and I've been there, and I love the underdog. Nobody. I'm coming in 7th round. Nobody believes. You just think about that. And here it is. I was the difference maker. and I come right in and I get a championship my first year. I love it. I mean, those are just great stories. Man.
Well, and I was going to say one more thing, and then bring it back to your topic was, you know, as a guy who lived out in Colorado for 9 years and talked about AFC West teams trying to build to beat the Chiefs, I can tell you, I don't think that was the Broncos case. I'm a conspiracy theorist, and I was convinced John Elway was literally trying to find the worst quarterbacks just to cement just to cement his status as the greatest Bronco quarterback ever.
Oh, that's hilarious! Because Russ did not cook. I don't know what he did, but he did not.
Russell
cook.
Wilson has some, and I'm a Russell Wilson fan. Being
I am as well. That's from Wisconsin, no question.
But man, so far he is not living up to that money he's been making by any means. But you talked about sometimes you're letting somebody go, and you didn't take enough time. It's just like in football. How many guys actually can't live up to their full potential because they're built for a 4-3 defense and they find themselves in a 3-4 scheme?
Exactly. And I think, again, you just don't notice people sometime on a team. And it's not that you don't want to notice them, but you get caught up on the shooting star. So you get that one or two person that come onto the team and they're always producing and they're always doing everything else. And in our busy lives, we can be caught up on just simply looking at the lightning in the bottle and forget about these folks that need to be developed and that can actually go on to win championships with you and actually become even better. So now you look at this, nobody's talking about Tyreek Hill anymore. I mean, you put that to bed now. Nobody talks about Tyreek. Nobody says, well, Patrick Mahomes doesn't have, you know, a number one, number two. It may be part of the talking heads, but clearly that didn't matter. And so when I think about that from an agency builder and looking at folks that have become those folks that I never thought they would be, it was just simply because I hadn't paid attention to them. And once I gave them attention and I looked and said, wait a minute, this person does have a certain amount of skill set that if developed and used properly and put into the right scheme, like you said. I mean, we look at sports all the time and we look at somebody who will leave from one team and go to another team where their skill set fits and they're a superstar. Yeah, and the other team, you never heard their name. They were riding the bench the whole time. And so that, I think, is the thing that we've got to be more aware of, the people on our teams and the skill set that they have. Because there's clearly people, first of all, I wouldn't have hired them if they didn't have some kind of skill set that they brought to the table. So I saw something there, but I just think if they don't get it right away or they don't just kind of shoot to the top right away, we're quick to look at their replacement as opposed to figuring out how do we develop.
Great analogy, though, to the insurance industry. When you have teams like the Chiefs, a Tyreek Hill, and they feel now they should be the superstar.
Yes.
And they say, I'm no longer, I'm going to go out on my own, or I'm going to this other agency because this team doesn't respect me or whatever it is. And then they end up over there and they go, whoa, wait a second.
Right.
Because there's no Pat Mahomes here?
Exactly.
I don't look as good as I used to.
Exactly. And I mean, I thought about that. And unfortunately, Tua had his situation last year. But even when Tyreek came out, he really kind of stoked the fire and said, well, look, this guy's more accurate. You know what I mean? Yep. And I'm like, wow, that's cold. But I think that, again, that the last laugh comes in and says, well, it was great having you, but we want to make sure that everybody understands that there's nobody bigger than the team. And I think that we hear that statement all the time, but you get caught up on, oh, man, this team will continue to roll if they have this person or if they have that person. But to look up and for them to be able to deliver, I can tell you what, whether he admits it or not, Tyreek would have liked to have a second ring. I don't care what anybody says because he was there. You know, when you're there, Andy, and you had the opportunity to get it, you know, it would have been great to get a second ring in 3 years. I mean, there's nothing to talk about. But again, the game is, how do we develop those other people, man? So I think that is the thing that most leaders lose the sight of at some point in time because you like Tyreek, you like to speak, because that's the sex appeal. That's sexy. And then nobody, you know, just doing the regular blocking and tackling, there's nothing sexy about that at all, Andy. It's simply just about being in a space where you're looking at what sells, and that's it.
Sorry.
Oh, no, you're good.
Yeah, no, you are absolutely right. You know, when you think about skill set, like what I just said earlier about, I think how many receivers and skill players leave a team like the Chiefs or the Patriots, and they realize, wait, Tom Brady made me look pretty good. Pat Mahomes made me look pretty good. Aaron Rodgers made me look pretty good.
Yes.
You know, going now back to why we're here today and having a conversation about developing a team, you know, this year, the ESPYs, the awards ceremony held by ESPN, just named the Kansas City Chiefs the team of the year.
Correct.
For good reasons.
Correct.
And it starts with the fact they have an amazing leader, Andy Reid.
Yes.
Let's talk about building a team in the insurance industry, because I think this is one of the biggest struggles we have right now in the industry is if we're going to build an agency that's built to thrive for the long term, it starts with the people you're bringing on the team. And I think there's this propensity to want to go find all-stars, right?
Absolutely.
And get the best people, the veterans, the people who've been out there for 10, 20 years. And I've seen it far more often than not that type of strategy backfires. So let's imagine we got somebody listening, Kareem, and they're like, all right, I am literally going to go out tomorrow and I'm going to start building a new insurance agency for the first time. Let's start with what you've done, because you have built an amazing firm at Great Lakes Benefits. If you look back at the time, the length of time you've had the agency, what would be some of the factors you would attribute to that have allowed you to build such a great team there?
So I'm gonna start the starting point, and this may sound very cliche-ish, Andy, but it's the facts. It started with me, right? I mean, I had to really look at how I was going to work on me, because how can I attract what I'm not, right? I mean, it's hard to go after Andy Neary if Andy Neary doesn't see that I bring something to the table that mirrors what Andy is about. And so if I'm looking at saying I want a superstar, well, one, I've got to think and believe as a superstar, and I've got to act and prepare as a superstar in order to attract them. And so that was the first thing I did. And so if I'm starting an agency today, I'm really starting looking at myself and saying, okay, how can I expect others to play in this league of mine? Because that's what it is, right? We've got our own league. How can I expect them to play on my team in this league, and yet I don't have the talent or skill set that I'm asking them to come to the table with? Why would they follow me? And so as a leader, I wanted to make sure that I was in position that people would want to follow me, that I didn't have to drag them. I didn't have to come, they didn't want to come and kicking and screaming, but they were just naturally attracted to something you and I talked about from the start. One, energy, right? But then also looking at the leadership and the vision of being able to go forward. So if I'm starting, I'm looking first of all internally and looking at myself to say, what skill set do I bring and who is it that I want to attract? From there, what I started when I look back on the agency is that I looked for all those, the kind of the top shooters from other agencies, different things where they were. But then I realized something real quick. As much as I had some of those folks that came onto the team, they brought their talents, but they also brought some of the garbage with them that they had been getting away with in those other agencies, as you just kind of alluded to. As a player, you watch these players, and I get it, they're holding out for whatever their financial situations are, what have you. But as the league always says, nothing bigger than the shield, right? The shield is the business, right? And so as long as the shield exists, there's nobody bigger than the shield. And so when I started looking at some of those folks, I really believe that I brought them over in those first couple of years. And as much as they did come and produce, Andy, they also brought some cancer with them, right? They brought some bad habits with them. And the unfortunate thing for me as a young leader at the time was that I kind of encouraged that. I encouraged that because they were the winners. They were producing. We were putting up big numbers. But as a whole, I would look back at the rest. There was a lot of carnage being left behind that I was not addressing because of that. And so the other thing that I would look at in terms of finding that is that I don't need you to be a superstar. You know, one thing I look at is probably my major factor in developing a team is that I always say, I can teach you skills. I can't teach you attitude, right? So I'm first of all looking at what type of attitude do you bring to the table? You could have never won before, but if you believe that you can win, I can coach that, Andy. If you believe that you can win, I can coach that, because now you just need the tactical pieces that we're talking about, right? In order for you to be successful, I need to give you some how-tos to be able to go. But if you come with that kind of thinking where you don't believe that you can win, you don't believe that you have the opportunity to win, that's something I look for. So that is one of my first traits that I look for in someone when they're coming on board with our team is, what type of attitude are you coming to the table with? Because I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to coach you. And I found myself when I had folks that had bad attitudes, Andy, you know what I found? I found myself having to sell them in the business day in and day out, trying to encourage. And at that point, I thought I was encouraging them. I really wasn't. I was really wearing myself out, trying to get them to think, and they were never going to do anything any different anyway. What they were going to do is to be what we talk about all the time. They were going to the transfer portal. And we already knew they're going to the transfer portal. They're going to ship out of here. They're going to go to somebody else's agency, take their bad attitude with them again. And I had to become comfortable with that. And so I think that as people are thinking about building, if you're starting that would be my number one attribute right off rip is, do they come with the right attitude that fits the culture that you have created as the leader.
And I would actually say attitude is more important than knowledge, because I think something that our industry puts a lot of emphasis on is somebody's knowledge. So that's what probably lends them to want to go find a veteran when it comes to an account manager or a producer or a sales director, right?
Yep.
And because they believe it's the knowledge that requires somebody that's going to allow somebody to have success. But at the end of the day, what they've acquired, to your point, is a cancer.
And I'll tell you, I mean, you and I have talked about this before, and I think I shared with you, one of my mentors told me a long time ago that I'll take ignorance on fire than knowledge on ice any day, right? And so when I had to think about that, is that, look, I'll take that fired up, somebody who just wants to go get it, I can coach them. But somebody who's got all the knowledge in the world and they're sitting there, let's face it, most of our prospects, most of our clients, when I've been doing this 25 years, and I'm talking about, I've dealt with companies over 5,000 lives down to smaller companies. What I found is that in most cases, the folks that we're talking to, they don't know what the hell is going on anyway. I mean, they're so busy, and that's not a knock on them. I'm just looking at, if I'm talking to an HR professional, he or she has 12 jobs. So I can't expect them to be the best at benefits. If we're talking about growing a benefits agency, I can't expect them to be the best on that, because they're onboarding, they're firing, they're doing payroll, they're doing compliance. I mean, you tell me that they're working on the payroll system. They're doing 1,000 things. So for me to expect them to know all the things that I know and have the knowledge base is crazy. So when I look at these folks that have all the knowledge in the world about, they can tell you everything about it, how insurance came into play, what it does. You can get into all that stuff. They ain't selling nothing. They're selling absolutely nothing, because the people they're trying to go in and talk to don't have the same knowledge space to even have that conversation and engage. I would probably go on the line to say, if in 5% of the folks that I talk to that have that same kind of knowledge base, I mean, a quarter of what I know about the business, then that's a big thing. But the most of them are looking at you to be the advisor to come in and give them guidance. And yes, you got to have a great knowledge base, but you also have to be able to be engaging with them, because this is a boring topic. Nobody gets excited to me about me coming in and talking about benefits, bro. I just have yet to see it yet. I've been waiting for somebody to say, man, I'm so fired up that my benefits guy is here. Not happening. And I've got great.
Well, I've made a couple posts out on LinkedIn about that recently, where I think we've developed this within the industry, this celebrity status of people in our industry. And I'm like, guys, at the end of the day, you got to remember, most of your prospects still put you on the same playing field as a used car salesman.
They do. They do. I mean, they because if it was about knowledge, all of the things that we've watched our industry evolve into over the last several years would be working. But how do you still find out that most people are still in fully insured plans? They're still doing the same status quo. They're still taking the spreadsheet and picking out what it is. And they're like, look, I'll see you next year. Because at the end of the day, we've gone to the celebrity status piece. But in terms of implementation of that, very rarely does it happen, because the other person on the other side doesn't know what the hell you're talking about. They have no clue. And they're trying to get back to the business at hand. Whatever that fire is that's burning, it surely as hell is not the benefits.
Yeah. When you look back at your career running Great Lakes, are there any, knowing what you know now, are there any things you look back on and go, man, as a young leader, I made that was a mistake? And that was any advice you could give a potentially new sales leader or agency owner where you're like, yeah, if I could talk to my younger self, I would have said, yeah, Kareem, don't do that.
Man, I'll tell you, so there's a few things that I look at that I would have done differently, right? And so one would simply just be, in looking at the onboarding process, having a true process that connected people. So part of this, and you started this out, and I'll talk about my weaknesses, and it's important to talk about, is in having a lot of energy, people are attracted to a lot of energy. However, if I didn't have the substance to go along with it, they can't be me. And so I didn't realize that early on. And so my training mechanism, and you and I have talked about this in the past, was, hey, come jump in the car with me, watch what I do, and replicate that. And that was the craziest thing ever. So there was no sales process. There was no sales cycle. It was simply follow me, do what I do. And if you do what I do, you'll have the same type of success. And so what I realized early on is that I ran a very personality-driven agency. So that is the first thing that I would say, is that while personality had a part in it, that there was very few tactical things that were there, because I just innately do what I do. I can't tell you how I do it, why I do it. I'm just wired that way, right? So when I look at it, it is my gifting from God that this is how I move. And so what I realize is that everybody doesn't flow like that. They don't flow like that. They don't function like that. So that's the first thing, is that I would say I would have to have systems in place. And what I would have done originally would have had somebody who had tactical knowledge and systems ability to partner with me such that I could be the energy guy, but I had something to then be able to say, hey, here's how you go and do this. So that would be the first thing that I would say that I would do different than what I did before. The second thing that I would say that I would do different is that, again, in building it, I would have been thinking a little bit more, even back then, on the technology side of what we could do to make ourselves more efficient. But I was still caught up, and I laugh at this, Andy. We talk about this because at 51, I don't think I'm an old guy, but in the insurance world, I'm an old guy, right? I mean, I'm still looking at here's your sales book. They'll take your sales book out. You know, here's what you'll do differently. And I just didn't see the technology play, even though it was there. You're talking 25 years ago, but still, had we embraced that a bit more earlier, it would have made a difference in terms, again, of how we moved and how efficient we moved, because I thought I needed a lot of people in order to get the numbers. And what I found out now is that I've got less folks, and we tripled the numbers that we were doing back then when I had a ton of folks running around. So the other thing was been this really kind of telling my younger self, like, hey, the technology thing, embrace this now, because it's going to make a huge difference in what you're going to do going down the road. And here's the third thing that I would have said to my younger self is back then, it was simply about the grind, the grind, the grind. I would have told my younger self to make sure that I was telling people about balance, right? Like, look, this, as much as we do what we do to go out, is not such that you lose your family and your kids in the process because we're out grinding, right? And so I think that that is still something that I look at now, is that there has to be that balance of, you know, if we're saying we're doing it for our families, then how's that we're gone 200 hours out the week, and I'm being facetious, but you know what I'm saying, where it's all about that and that's it. And we never put any emphasis on the family, because now, okay, it's great that we make a ton of money, but a ton of money and do what? I mean, what have we done if our kids are not spending time with us? And so those are the three things that I think that I would look back at my younger self, that I would have told those agents back then that, hey, we want to get, and I did a somewhat decent job of saying to them, get your spouse involved in what you're doing, let him or her know kind of what the process is, because you're going to be spending this time. But I never really spent time talking on the balance. And it was just our generation of grind. And I've watched that leave a lot of people in a lot of ditches and holes on the side of the road.
Well, and I think what you just said is very profound. Because number one, just do what I do. That's one of the reasons we lack good training in this industry. Is I think a lot of leaders who've been around for many years try to train their advisors by saying, just do what I do. And listen, there's a reason Michael Jordan's not a coach. Woo! There's a reason some of the best players in sports aren't coaches. They can't just say, do what I do.
Correct.
You've got to be able to train based on where these people are at. But I also want to throw a word of caution out there, because you talked about the balance, right? But at the same time, I think there's a lot of advisors coming in, they're sold the lifestyle and they don't have the work ethic. Yes. And out of the gate, they're trying to create balance. There's a part there. Yes, you got to work your ass off.
Yes.
To get to where you want to go. But to your point, don't sacrifice everything outside of business for the sake of business.
That's exactly it.
There's a couple topics I know that are very near and dear to both your heart and my heart. Let's go there. Let's start with defining what is a good leader. Ooh. I think you and I have talked about at length this problem. I'll call it a problem in our industry, where somebody's promoted to the role of sales director, sales manager, whatever the job title is, because they have sold the most insurance. Does that make them a sales leader, Kareem Cade?
No, not at all. Not at all. Matter of fact, I've seen those to be some of the worst sales leaders that I've seen in the industry, right? That means that they've been promoted because they're great, but can they lead anybody? And the answer is simply they cannot. They're not efficient. Most of the time when I see them, and I mean, I'm going to call it as I see it, the ego won't allow them to be an effective leader, right? Because that means that they have to shift or they have to change. And they've been so big on their own respective egos that it won't allow them to shift or change, because in their mind, they're still producing. Well, they are as an individual producer, but when you look back and start thinking about the folks that are following, nobody's following them. Nobody wants to be around them. You know, they're their own pariah. So when I look at that, I don't see them as being the most efficient. Now, there's a few that have that hybrid, have that ability to be that person that's out front and grooving at that level, but also in a space where they can look back and see, how do I train and bring up other people? But when we look at the definition of leadership now, and we start taking those folks and putting those folks who've been the top in sales, and that we need to leave them in their own place. We need to leave them right where they are. Let them do what they're doing. and let's find other people that can be more efficient in that space. And I think you and I have determined, even if the guy wasn't the best player on the field, we've watched those people come in to be the best coaches. They had the best IQs. They had the ability to motivate, to get people to understand. And because they understood the field, they could relate that information the same. And so I've looked at now over the years to say, well, okay, because I've been out on the front line and I was out selling, and I'm still selling today, right? I have the ability to be able to come back and relate that to someone new who's coming into the industry without being so high on, hey, look at all my awards, look at all the things I've done. This is nothing. That has nothing to do with them being successful. I've always said, I can't spend your money, Andy. So it's great that you tell me that you made a gazillion dollars. I can't live in your house. I can't drive your car. And here's more importantly, I don't know what you're doing to maintain that. So I think people get caught up on looking at the leader's success or perceived success and wanting what they have without really understanding what they're doing to maintain it. And I'm like, it always had to be with integrity for me as well. Like I'm not going to do, something outside of what's the integrity side of this thing to get this thing done. So I think when we start talking about those sales leaders, when we start looking, I was just watching something yesterday, one of the biographies on the gentleman who was running FTX, the Bitcoin piece, and just all this, but people were caught up on his hype. They were caught, so they were never looking at the business model, right? Until it all came imploding and fell down. Is that you're like, oh, wait a minute. But those signs were always there. And so I think when we start talking about leaders, we've got to make sure that we look up under the hood of a leader, right? We've got to know what that leader actually possesses to bring to the table before we just crown them as the leader simply because they had great sales in their own personal career.
Well, and go back the last 10 years, go look at the last 10 Super Bowls. I'd love to know how many of the coaches representing the Super Bowl teams are Hall of Fame football players. My guess is none of them.
Now, my guess would be that as well. My guess would be that as well.
And with that philosophy of hiring, promoting the person with the best sales results, I see two big problems. Number one, you're taking that person out of production.
Yes.
Which is a bad move.
Yes.
But two, I've seen this become a trend in agencies lately where when you are still a producer at heart and now you're supposed to run a team, what ends up happening is you actually go out with your producers and try to sell the case on your own just to get the revenue. And these producers aren't learning a damn thing. You're actually going out and just closing it for them. And that becomes a big problem culturally as well, because your numbers are looking good, but at the end of the day, your producers really aren't growing or actually having success. You're the one having the success for them.
Exactly. And so you can't replicate yourself. You think about that, Andy. There's no way to replicate yourself if that is the model that you're taking. And I found that out early in my career. I'm like, wow, okay, Kareem. My team teases me today, and they're like, yeah, well, everybody. You're great friends with everybody. I've never seen anybody. Today, they were talking about how many weddings I've been in, that I've been in like 9 weddings, right? And they're like, nobody is in 9 weddings. Like this is unheard of. And I'm like, you're like best man in like 6 of them. Like, who has 6 friends that call? And I'm like, well, I just have worked on building relationships with folks over the years. That's my superpower, right? Everybody has their superpower, but that's my superpower. But for me to expect other people to be able to replicate that, that's unfair of me to put that on them. And I think that when we talk about leaders that are in those places that have been the top salespersons and they know what they do, but the average person is not going to spend those types of hours. They're not going to do those types of things. They're not going to be in those kind of environments. Not that they can't, but they'll do it at a different level than you. I think you set yourself up for failure and you set them up for failure. And then I think the worst part about that is what I see happening in our industry as well, is that people who could make it and could be great advisors in our business, they get out, man, because they've been around someone that did not build them up, but actually tore them down more than when they came. And they just feel like there's no way that I can make it in this business, and they're off doing something else. And we're at a critical space in our business where we know, average age 57-year-old male in our business, that if we don't begin to shift and change that, and you and I have talked about this over the years, that we're going to have an industry that will be outdated, which it already is, right? But we just won't have the youth, those folks coming in to look at our business because they don't think they can make it happen.
Yeah, you bring up an underappreciated metric of relationship building. How many times have you been the best man in a wedding? That's a great metric to determine how good you are at building relationships. Let's segue now into my last question for you, which is what you just said. Okay, you're building a team. Kareem, what do agencies have to do to improve the level of training they're giving their producers?
So let's start training, but let me take it back even before we start training, because I think it's the other piece. First of all, we've got to be open to recruiting all kind of people to our business, right? And so what do I mean by that? You and I talked about this, Andy, but I find it important. I mean, if I got a guy with a gauge in his ear, I've got somebody with some tattoos on their arm, I can't disqualify them simply because I grew up in an era where it was a three-piece suit and this is what everybody did. That dog no longer hunts, right? Everybody's not in 3.6. And guess what? The folks that this person is going to attract, those are the next generation of leaders that are coming behind. They don't relate to me in my three-piece suit. So just as much as I don't relate to them in their tattoos and maybe their gauge, if I'm that type of leader, then how can I expect them to relate to me if I'm still saying, well, the only way you can do this is that you've got to be suited and booted every single day, because that's just not the way that they operate, right? And especially post-pandemic, really folks are not there. I mean, being in Tampa, very rarely do I see people in a full suit and tie. First of all, it's hot as shit. But then outside of that, you just don't see it. Like, the culture has changed. So I think before we can even get to that piece, we've got to be open to the fact that we've got to recruit differently. We've got to look at people differently. We've got to use a different set of evaluation. The evaluation before used to be like, it'd be great to have a military person or a sports athlete, somebody who's had, you know, the ability to be disciplined. And while all those things are still true, you want to have that element of that. You know what? It's something to be said about these younger folks that come in and they just have fresh ideas because we've been doing it the same way the entire time, right? And so if we continue to go down that road, I think we lose sight of some of the talent that exists out there that we've not even tapped into that can take our insurance industry to a whole nother level. So I think starting there would be the key. Now, when we start talking about moving over and shifting to training, I think that we've got to look at saying again, doing things differently, that we've got to have fresh concepts coming from training. I know people who are still training the same way that we trained 30 years ago. And if we're thinking about that, one is outdated. Outside of it being outdated, we can't get anybody engaged long enough to be willing to do that. I mean, it's hard for me to keep my daughter engaged with me when I'm talking about, hey, I don't use this type of technology. She's looking at me like, are you kidding me, Dad? Like, why are you still doing this? I am still the guy that I'm checking off. I don't want you to have these cookies. I don't want you to have. She's like, Dad, can you just click on the app and we can keep moving? I'm like, well, no, I'm not giving them this. So I think that when you have that same thought and process and training, right, you're looking at a situation where I'm still training people the way that I think as a 51-year-old, and I can't attract them. So I've got to begin to shift and start changing and saying, okay, how does social media? You and I joke about this all the time. I'm a LinkedIn guy only. You have been a big influencer for me in that realm. Outside of that, I've never had a TikTok. I've never had an Instagram. I've never had a Snapchat. I've never had a Facebook. So when you think about that, how am I going to attract those kind of folks that's all they know? That's all my daughter knows. That's the only world that she plays in. Her space for getting information and news is TikTok. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding. Like, is that your news source? And she's like, yeah, Dad, are you still waiting to turn on CNN, to find out the news? You got to watch that whole reel replay itself for a full hour before you get to, I'm clicking on this. And so I think that we've got to change. If we're going to begin to train them, we've got to start taking the things that they are accustomed to using, getting out of our own ways, right? And putting them in position to be able to empower us to do more business, utilizing the new way of doing business, because we're outdated, bro. I mean, it's just it. I mean, my team was just telling me today, utilizing some AI stuff, and they were telling me all this stuff with AI and how we can do some other content and blah, 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 blah. And it's blowing me away, all of the stuff that they're telling me about. And they're like, oh, the iteration we were talking to you about 6 months ago, Kareem, yeah, this thing, it's like before you had a nice Camaro, now you got a souped up vet. I mean, and I'm just listening to this stuff like, wow. But if I don't allow them to be part of my agency and start looking at the training, then I'm outdated. I'm laid behind. So I think that in shifting that training and starting to utilize the new ways of selling, and it cannot be that, here's what I still don't believe, Andy, and I could be wrong. I still don't believe that relationships will go to the wayside. I still say that there's something to be said about some contact and there's some relationships. However, I do understand that people make better buying decisions by having their own time to make their decisions. And they're going to do that through some kind of platform. So for those agency owners like myself that have just put themselves in an outdated category, we either better shit or get off the pot, right? Because we're going to be left behind. And I think in training these new folks, they bring something to us, but we also have to be open and show that we're looking to go down that road such that we can attract them into the agency first and then find them different ways to be able to train. Because to tell them to go out and do 10-3-1, to tell them to go out and knock on 100 doors, they're going to look at me like they're crazy. You want me to go outside and look at 100 doors when I can get online and I can touch 2,000 people on the app, and you want me to go knock on 100 doors? That's never going to make sense to them. And if we don't do something different in that training, we can forget about it.
Well, and here's the reality. It's hard to prepare for the future when you're so proud of the past.
Woo! Oh, I'm going to steal that.
Yeah, it's hard. I use that in my keynotes. It's hard to prepare for the future when you're proud of the past. And I think our industry, by and large, is still proud of what we did 30 years ago. And, here's the reality. Here's where I'm optimistic, though, Kareem. We can poo-poo the millennials and the Gen Zs, but they are going to be, and already are, the first generations that come into these situations and go, why are we doing it that way?
Why are we doing it that way?
Look at your daughter. She's already, Dad, why are you doing it that way? That is what that generation, by the way, if you're an advisor still selling the way you did 20 years ago, this applies to your decision makers at your prospects. They're going to come in and say, why are we doing it this way?
Yes. Yes.
Now,
why are we doing it this way?
Here's an example. You and I, when we got in the business, were taught, go where your prospects hang out. Back then, what was that? That was the country club.
Yep.
So I was told to go buy a membership, even though I couldn't afford it, at a country club, because that's where my prospects hang out. Go eat lunch at the most expensive restaurant in town, because that's where the CEOs hang out, right? Well, guess what? Where are they hanging out today?
Yep.
This phone I have in my hand, that is the country club today.
Yeah. That's it.
So you have to adjust where your prospects are hanging out, and your prospecting strategy, your training, has to teach producers how to hang out there as well. So I'm glad you brought that up. So Kareem, you and I could go all afternoon, man, as we always do. But people listening, if somebody listening is like, this dude, well, number one, I love his energy. Number two, I would just love to reach out and say, because you and I are working, we have a program we have been putting out there. I think a lot of people just think you and I are doing it for fun, but we actually have a program.
We're too old for that, Andy.
We're too old for that shit. And it's a leadership workshop that we have developed to help agencies and insurance companies bring the right leadership development to their companies. But if somebody wanted to reach out to you, Kareem, what are the easiest ways to get a hold of you?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, LinkedIn always. Now, I will say this, guys. I just talked about all the stuff I don't do. LinkedIn, I look at LinkedIn. But outside of that, they can reach out to me directly. Email, and I'm sure you'll be able to put that up in the chat or something like that. Andy, reach out to me. But I'm just big on, I think you and I have talked about this, just being big on sharing the information. Now, granted, do I have all the time in the world to sit back and just share all day long? No, I don't. However, I've looked at that as being a part of what my give back has to be to this industry. So I think so many times we get caught up on if it's not being paid for. And time is money. We know that time is money. But there's opportunities where it's just that somebody needs to have that quick 5-minute conversation. Now, here's the thing that you and I talk about all the time. This is not calling to pick my brain for free. This is just saying, you know what, if there's one or two things that we could share, if it's just about building a relationship, I'm all for that. But I am a capitalist as well. But I think reaching out LinkedIn, reaching out to me via email, I'm all for all those things and just open. I think, and from the platforms that we've talked or spoke on before, Andy, I've come out of that with just some good folks that I've met. That it just may be that you just need to have that encouragement. This thing will work if you work it. I mean, you've got to work it, but it will work and it will produce those things that people have talked about. But it's just about having good mentorship. The last thing I'll say about that is that you and I have talked about this a while. I think that mentorship is still the shortcut to success in our business, right? In any business, is that you have somebody who's gone there before you, someone who's done it before you. I can tell you where I've made those mistakes, like the questions you asked me today. And this is where I see the opportunities are today moving forward. I have not seen it any brighter, even with all the nonsense in our industry, it being archaic. I just think it's one of those places that if you dial in properly into this business right now, that you can go out and change the whole game because it's there to be changed. And nobody has done it single-handedly today. It's still so many things that need to evolve. And they're just about taking the right people to come and look at it. So if I can be of any service, I'd love to do that.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to make 2 asks to our audience before we wrap up here. If you are a veteran like Kareem and I, and you've been around for a long time, I urge you, I beg you to think about how our world has evolved in the last 3 years and apply that evolution to your business. The way you did it 15, 20 years ago does not apply like it does today. Or does not apply the way it used to, I should say. And if you're one of our younger producers listening in, push back against what your agency is doing. Say, we need to do things differently. Don't just give up your voice because somebody told you this is the way we do it in the industry. We need more of that voice to evolve and change this industry for the better. So keep your voice shining. So with that being said, Kareem, I want to thank you, man.
Man, I appreciate you, man.
A blast as always. For everybody else listening in, take Kareem's words and apply them. This guy.
And you know, my last statement though, Andy. How about them Chiefs?
And with that, we'll call it a wrap. Take Kareem's advice. Go out and build a team designed to win today. Be well.